Happy New Year, everybody, and welcome to today's learning session, the first of 2015. Today we'll be talking about REDD outcomes from COP20, and this webinar is organized by World Wildlife Fund's Forest and Climate Program. My name is Breen Burns, and I'm a manager for learning and communications. Our presenters today are Josefina Braña-Varela, our policy director with the WWF Forest and Climate Program, and for the first time in his new role, Peter Graham, our new team leader for the WWF Forest and Climate Program. So before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. For those of you who participated in our past sessions, this will sound familiar. But yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the YouTube channel, just go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate, or go to panda.org/forestclimate and look for the REDD learning section on the left-hand side of that page. There are two audio options. You can listen via your computer, or you can dial in through the phone numbers that were provided in your registration email. Please note that sometimes you might experience audio difficulties when you're listening to your computer, and this is sometimes caused by having too many software applications or browser windows open. So please feel free to close some of them, and that usually solves the issue, or you can always join us by phone. If you are having any technical difficulties, please send me or Jenny Guzman a message via the chat area, and we'll try to get it sorted out. Questions are absolutely welcome. Please submit your questions for Josefina and Peter through the toolbar on your screen, and we'll answer as many as we have time for during our session. After the webinar, you'll receive a link in the follow-up email to a place on the reddcommunity.org website, which is a free online learning platform, where you can access a PDF copy of this presentation and also find a link to the recording there. So thank you again for joining us, and with that, we'll turn it over to Josefina, and she will walk us through today's session. Josefina, over to you.
Thanks, Breen, and Happy New Year to everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar. Today we are going to talk about the results from COP20 and what was discussed in Lima. So I'm going to give a brief introduction on what was the landscape of the discussions there, and then we're going to talk about the specific technical issues as well as the discussions on the role of the forest and the land use sector and finance. And we will go through brief conclusions then. Next one, please, Breen. Okay, so what happened in Lima? If you remember, we came out from last COP in Warsaw with a package of decisions on REDD, known as the Warsaw Framework for REDD, and that was considered, or is considered, the REDD Plus rulebook. However, there are some issues that are still unresolved. So in Lima, the forest and climate agenda was addressed in different forums and platforms. Before the COP started, the final meeting of the REDD Plus partnership took place. Then we had discussions more in the technical side that were held in the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, the SOSTA, and just a brief decision that needed to be approved by the subsidiary body for implementation, the SBI. Later, we had the voluntary focal points meeting, which was the first meeting after it was mandated or encouraged by parties in Warsaw. And finally, there were discussions through the ad hoc working group on the Durban platform for enhanced action, what you probably have heard a lot about the ADP discussions. So Peter will talk a little bit about the discussions in that forum as well. In addition to these more formal exchanges and discussions and negotiations, there were several side events throughout the 2 weeks of the negotiations, including the first REDD Plus Day celebrated during the conference of the parties. And this REDD Plus Day is the first time it's celebrated. It was suggested by the president of the COP, Manuel Pulgar Vidal, and this day it took place on December 8th. And it was a space for showcasing different progress or announcements around the REDD Plus arena, including the presentation of formal presentation to the convention of reference levels from some of the parties. Mexico and Malaysia coming to my mind right now, but there were others, Colombia, Indonesia, among others, that presented their data on reference levels to be assessed. Just follow the first delivery of the reference level that was made by Brazil last June. Next one, please. Okay, let's jump into the technical negotiations and discussions that happened into SOBSTA. As some of you may know, there were a couple of issues that were still pending from last year that are still unresolved. One of them, actually there are three issues: the safeguards issues, the joint mitigation and adaptation mechanism, and the non-carbon benefits. But as you may remember, the non-carbon benefits is not going to be touched until June. So for the first one, the considerations regarding the need for further guidance on the issue of REDD Plus safeguards, parties have been discussing whether they need to adopt further guidance or not on what kind of information countries need to include in the summaries of information that will be submitted on how they are addressing and respecting the safeguards. This topic was really divided. There was a really clear divergence in the positions from developed and developing countries. The vast majority of REDD countries consider that no further guidance is needed at this point, and they consider that developed countries are assuming that they won't provide the information that is needed to carry out an assessment on how they are addressing and respecting safeguards. So REDD countries were like, no, we don't need more guidance now, and donor countries or developed country parties were insisting in having guidance adopted that will ensure that the information is provided will be enough or will be sufficient enough to provide the opportunity to make an assessment of this information. So the discussions really were very short. They didn't have enough time to come on to an agreement, and given that they were like really divergent, parties were unable to agree. So no decision came out of these discussions, and they will continue this topic on June in 2015. This year in June, the next subsidiary bodies meeting. The second topic in the agenda for Lima in SOBSTA was the consideration of development of methodological guidance on non-market-based approaches. This issue has been under discussion for a while, but mainly because of other policy approaches, meaning the proposal that Bolivia put in the table about the joint mitigation and adaptation mechanism. So Bolivia has been insisting that the convention recognizes other policy approaches different from REDD, and that the joint mitigation and adaptation mechanism should have their own methodological guidance as well. Parties haven't been able to agree on what kind of methodological guidance needs to be developed. So Bolivia in this session presented a draft text, a proposal of what probable decision on this matter would look like to be the basis of the discussions in Lima. However, parties could not agree that the text will have the right elements to be the starting point of the discussions. So again, there was no agreement on this issue, no agreement really on how to treat the issue, if it has to be a separate issue on the agenda, or if discussions will keep going on under the REDD agenda item. So because there was no agreement, again, this discussion will continue in June. Okay, so those were the discussions on the SOBSTA. No decision or conclusions were agreed by parties, so simply the chair of SOBSTA mentioned that these discussions will continue on June, which is pretty much, well, the last chance the parties have to come into an agreement, given that most of the time in the next COP is going to be dedicated to the new climate agreement. So the June session is the last opportunity for them to come to agreements in these two topics. But there was another platform, another session that needed to take place, and this was an outcome from the Warsaw discussions in which the decisions encourage parties to meet in a voluntary basis in what is called the National Entities or Focal Points meeting. So this first session or this first meeting in Lima had the intention to agree on the procedural matters on how these annual meetings will be organized. So it was not about content and about actually starting exchanging the information about gaps and needs that was mandated in Warsaw. It was more about getting organized and agree on how these meetings will take place. So in general terms, there was convergence regarding the status of the meetings. They are voluntary. They do not hold a formal status within the UNFCCC, meaning that the decisions or whatever conclusions they come up in the annual meeting is not it has not the intention to influence the negotiations or the proposed decisions, neither to the UNFCCC or the Green Climate Fund. I mean, there could be meaningful discussions, but they don't have any status as other bodies of the convention that recommend decisions to the COP for adoption. In terms of organization, parties agreed that the voluntary meetings of the focal points will be co-chaired by the incoming and outgoing COP presidencies. So in this case, for example, in Lima, the co-chairs of the meeting were Poland as outgoing presidency of the COP and Peru as incoming presidency. Most participants expressed the interest in sharing information and experiences, in particular related to improvement of the coordination of support, which was it's close to the mandate in Warsaw, as well as identifying needs and gaps. But important to highlight that everybody talking in the meeting were highlighting that the perspective of implementation needs to be brought to these meetings, meaning that this meeting is not a negotiation session, is an opportunity for exchanging experiences and lessons learned, identifying gaps and needs from the perspective of implementation. So for me that was very important. And the other highlight that was very positive is that participants were encouraged or encouraging transparency and broad participation. In that sense, stakeholders were invited to participate actively as an equal member of the meeting of the annual meetings. So CSO observers are welcome and are encouraged to participate actively. And I guess with that we conclude like the part of the technical discussions on the substance. Just to, before giving the floor to Peter, just to mention that SBI also had a minor discussion in plenary just to adopt the Information Hub experts meeting report. That we talked about this before the COP. There was an experts meeting to discuss about the characteristics that the Information Hub need to have. So that report from that meeting that happened in the last semester of 2014 was adopted by SBI. So now the Secretariat is moving forward with the design of the Information Hub to make it operative. And with that, I will pass the floor to Peter so he can talk about the role of forests and the discussions that took place in Lima.
Thank you, Josefina, and hello everyone. As most of you are aware, the ad hoc working group on the Durban platform is the main body under which the parties are working to develop both the post-2020 regime, the Paris Agreement as we're calling it, as well as work to increase ambition pre-2020. However, from the point of view of the land sector and forests, there has not been to date a formal series of discussions within that process to move the recognition of land sector forward in any detail. Now, given the importance of the land sector and the range of accounting approaches countries have used so far, we were hoping for greater specificity in the type of information that would related to the treatment of forests and the land sector that parties would include in their upfront information along with their intended nationally determined contributions. For example, what would be the coverage, would it be all lands or activities, would a country be using reference level or base year, how would they be accounting for housewood products and the impact of natural disturbances, for example. So this is something we were pushing for, and many parties were pushing for, to be discussed at least by the ADP, and unfortunately that wasn't the case. What we were also urging parties to do in the work stream on the pre-2020 was to provide more information and specificity, on the immediate mitigation actions in their sectors, in the land and forest sector, including through REDD+, to help close the income gap before 2020. Now, in Lima, all we got through the discussions on the ADP was a tangential reference to other sources and sinks in the Lima call for climate action. And so it leaves it up to the parties at this point to determine the type of information that they'd really like to include in their upfront information with their NDCs. Now, of course, we have some meetings between now and Paris to encourage parties to provide that additional information. And the purpose of that information, following the spirit of transparency or the principle of transparency, is to enable others to assess the role that forest and land sector might have in a country's ambition. So this is about, to some extent, comparability and being able to determine in the end, in aggregate, the ambition of countries relative to the 2-degree goal. Next slide, please. And under climate finance, REDD finance, excuse me, there was not significant progress within the negotiations in Lima. There were no significant developments along the lines of long-term finance related to REDD+, nor in the development of market mechanisms, whether a new market mechanism under the convention or a framework of various approaches. So that was slightly disappointing because this is what I would call the final element in the REDD+ mechanism. That is an operational link to adequate and predictable finance. So looking forward, WWF will be continuing to urge parties to make commitments to REDD finance, both for the mid and long term, beyond their existing commitments. There is still a fair bit of money in the different banks and institutions from fast start commitments, but there's a clear demand for longer term certainty about REDD finance. And the second, of course, is to make sure we come up with a pathway for REDD finance up to 2020 and beyond. Without scaling up efforts and guaranteeing adequate and predictable support, we find that developing countries won't be able to make the shift to low emissions development path for sustainable economic growth. Unfortunately, as we mentioned in the negotiations, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for those views to be expressed, or certainly not taken up in consideration of text for the Paris Agreement. However, we do have on the next slide some developments by the financial institutions, financial mechanism of the convention. For example, the GCF has managed to develop an initial logic and performance measurement framework for REDD+ results-based payments that was approved by the board in October. This was a significant development, and at the same time in Lima, the GCF was also able to capitalize, to achieve its capitalization target of $10 billion US. With a healthy proportion of this expected to go to forests, at least a somewhat positive step on the road to predictable, if not adequate, finance for REDD has been met. The second development is the work of the Standing Committee on Finance. Now, just a little background, the SCF was established by COP16 in Mexico to assist the COP in exercising its functions in relation to the financial mechanism of the convention, and including improving the coherence and coordination in the delivery of climate change finance. And it was decided that its next forum was to discuss forest finance, and that will be taking place in June in this year. Two elements of this forum, one will be on the ways and means to transfer payments for results-based actions, as referred to in the decision from COP18, and then also be looking at the provision of financial resources for alternative approaches. To inform or use as basis of the discussions for the SCF forum this year, a working paper has been drafted and is open for further inputs by the end of this month, 31st of January. A number of the questions that the forum is intended to respond to or to discuss include, for example, which are the key actors in financing agricultural, forestry, and other land use activities that impact on forest. What role can financing institutions play in achieving more sustainable investments in forestry and related activities? And how can results-based payments most effectively promote REDD activities, and what case studies could inform us? So we're hoping that through further input to the SCF and through discussions in that forum, that the report that will come out of that will provide some useful input to parties and to the governing bodies of the various entities of the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC, the Global Environment Facility, and the GCF, in order to move forward the operationalization of REDD finance that is adequate and predictable. And the REDD Plus partnership. Some of you may know this was established back, or formally launched by heads of state and ministers back in Oslo in May 2010. It was to serve as a global platform for organizing action in order to enable effective, transparent, and coordinated fast action on reducing GHGs from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries. It kind of came on the heels of some of the first major financing announcements under the Fast Start program in Copenhagen. And this last meeting in Lima was indeed the final meeting of this interim platform, the REDD Plus partnership. And there was a useful summary done, commissioned by the partnership to look at its effectiveness and its legacy in a sense. And looking back at what the objectives of the partnership were, fivefold in a sense: contribute to the global battle on climate change, serve as interim platform for the partners, scale up REDD Plus actions and finance, improve REDD Plus initiatives and financial instruments, and then facilitate knowledge transfer, capacity enhancements, mitigation actions, and technology development and transfer. That was a fairly ambitious objective for the partnership. For those involved who have experienced it, it was not necessarily a smooth road. However, there were some significant achievements recognized. One, that it did serve as an informal space to facilitate progress in the formal negotiations. It was an effective platform for sharing lessons learned, exchanging REDD Plus country experiences. And the third point, the voluntary reporting database. Not perfect by any means, but serves possibly as the best available information on REDD Plus finance that we have to date. And also, it did advance the field of understanding and exploration into REDD Plus finance barriers and opportunities. In terms of legacy, I'd see the voluntary reporting database, the VRD, as a useful tool that will continue. The partnership did agree to hand over the database management to the FAO, at least for the period of January 2015 to December 2016, based on remaining budget. And also, as a legacy, it has created a REDD Plus community and built significant capacity in members over the course of the years. And also it has increased cooperation amongst multilateral initiatives. This is partly facilitated by a secretariat that was co-led by the World Bank Facility Management Team of the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, as well as the UN REDD organization. And the legacy then is transferred on to some extent to be determined by the meeting of the focal points that Josefina referred to. And hopefully this will serve as a useful forum to continue knowledge transfer, building capacity, and addressing some of the outstanding issues we have within the negotiations and within countries in implementation. So with that, I will hand it over to Breen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Josefina. And we are now open for questions. You will see that this webinar is unique in that we have saved nearly half an hour for questions, so please don't be shy. And you can submit your questions using the question tool on your GoToWebinar toolbar. So to get us started, the first question that I will hand over to Josefina and or Peter is, so what's next for Paris? What are some of the milestones or key points and actions we want to see or need to see over the next 12 months, a little bit less at this point? Josefina, do you want to kick us off? Thank you.
Yeah, I can start with that, and then Peter may want to jump in as well. Well, for this year, parties had a lot of work to do in order to come close to a text that could be agreeable for adoption in Paris. Actually, they don't have a lot of time. They have to have a draft text around May to comply with the requirements of the convention. So there will be an intersessional meeting in February, at the beginning of February, in Geneva, to keep discussing and to pick up the text as they left it in Lima. So in Geneva, they have to take on the annex for the annex that was adopted or that was included in the Lima call for climate action, and they have to work in that elements paper to see how the new climate agreement would be looking. So there's a lot. If you check that annex where the elements are, it's an annex. It's a text that has lots of options, and it's very, very crowded, and it's very unclear right now. I mean, because each paragraph had many options. So they have to work on that, and they have to come close to a text that would be ready for agreeing in Paris. So that would be in Geneva. They have to do that. Then we have the intersessional of the subsidiary bodies in June. And it's very likely we are expecting to see another intersessional happening in the fall before Paris. So it's going to be a busy year, and we are running out of time. So I guess we'll be reporting back on those meetings as well.
I'll just, Peter, I'll just add one thing to Josefina's comments, and that would be some of the, given that it's a relatively short timeline to Paris and the importance of the overarching decision on a legally binding agreement or agreement with legal force, that there will undoubtedly be questions related to parties' nationally determined contributions and the information provided that will require a process after parties to assess, and this is something that we're hoping to have more discussion on by the parties in these intersessional meetings.
Thank you. And I'm going to advance this slide just so people have something else to look at as we're going through the questions. So there's some resources here if you'd like to check those out. So the next question is from Tim, and Tim asks, are the increasingly available experiences of REDD Plus projects likely to feed into the discussions at the Substa June session?
Well, given that discussions in June for REDD will focus on the safeguards, the need for further guidance, the issue of the joint mitigation adaptation mechanism from Bolivia, and also non-carbon benefits, I guess there's a couple of topics there that could be benefited from experiences in the ground. That is probably the safeguards topic and the non-carbon benefits topic. However, at this point, these questions are so specific. It sounds a little bit difficult to incorporate a lot of experiences from the ground. But in terms of safeguards, definitely, because if we see progress and there's good experiences to be communicated or ideas on how to tackle this issue, as well as in the issue of non-carbon benefits, which is another topic that remains open, I believe there's room for that, and there's room for exchanging information from here until June to try to influence those discussions.
Great, thank you. So the next question comes from Ali, and Ali asks, do you see the expansion of the REDD Early Movers Program, which is Germany and Norway funding to Colombia and Ecuador, as a significant step on finance? So probably Peter, we'll take our first stab at that.
Sure. Sorry, I'm still getting used to this webinar system. Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. And as we said, Peter is doing his first webinar as our new leader, so we are thrilled to have him on here, and there's a little bit of a learning curve with the system. So Ali asks, do you see the expansion of the REDD Early Movers Program, which is Germany and Norway funding to Colombia and Ecuador, as a significant step on finance?
Yes, thank you, Ali. I do see that as a significant step. This is something that's at a scale that is of interest to national governments, and something that will encourage more than just perhaps the forest ministers in certain cases to pay attention to the need to look at policies and activities related to the land sector and not just the forest in the case of drivers. And so I do see this as a very helpful step. And as Josefina mentioned, in Lima, there were a number of announcements like this that were made both by donors as well as commitments made by developing countries in terms of commitments to action, and not just short term but longer term. So while progress within the negotiations might have been somewhat disappointing, to put it mildly, the developments outside through actions like this was certainly appreciated.
Thank you. And the next question, I think probably Josefina can take the... Oh, did you want to add? Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I just want to add to that question. For me, the announcement of the expansion of the REDD plus early movers was a good indication of at least another donor consistently coming in with the finance. It's not only Norway, it's now also Germany jumping in with more commitments. And for me, that's a good signal. It's a thing to highlight. But we are also calling for other countries that are still not contributing to the REDD plus finance through bilateral cooperation or through the multilateral channels that are already there to come in and join these donors that have been consistent with their commitments, right? Like it's Germany and Norway. So it's a good signal to send, and it's a good opportunity for to encourage other donors to come in as well.
Thank you. So the next question, I think probably Josefina can jump in on first, and the question is from Tobias. What's next for the landscape approach and REDD Plus? Will forest and other land uses be more integrated in the future within the UNFCCC?
I could probably have a start.
Well, as Peter was discussing, go ahead, Peter, because you were discussing all this.
Sure. So whether the landscape approach will be integrated more within the UNFCCC is a good question. That is certainly the direction in which discussions, if not within the formal negotiations but outside with parties, is heading, is that there needs to be a greater integrated consideration of activities in the land sector with regard to mitigation and adaptation. Now, it's not clear how at this point that sort of integration will happen within the UNFCCC process. However, what we do see is a greater integration within countries as they develop their national strategies or plans from the developed country side in terms of determining and setting up plans to meet their commitments, as well as in REDD countries, for example, recognizing that clearly the actions of other land sector users and activities has a clear impact on REDD Plus goals. And so, for example, this is the relationship to drivers within a landscape context. So that's, we'll see as we get into discussions, probably not leading into Paris. The high-level elements of the text that we would see in a Paris Agreement may not mention the landscape approach per se, but should recognize the multiple roles or activities within the land sector that will contribute to mitigation and adaptation. Josefina, if you have anything to add.
No, I think you covered it all, Peter.
So the next question is a finance question. Do we yet have, and this is from Andy, thank you Andy, do we yet have an indication of what finances have reached conservation practitioners and rural developing country communities in relation to the total international spend on REDD+? Are there any future projections on this?
Well, I guess I'll start on that. And I would say that the answer would be somewhat not really. We do not have a clear indication about how much of the finance is reaching, well, conservation practitioners can be a fairly broad term because it could be the money that's going into government agencies that are responsible for the management of the forests and natural resources. In that case, there's a fair bit that's going to that or has gone to that. Getting down to the rural developing country communities is a more difficult question, and this I see is in terms of results-based finance. We have not yet seen that working to any great extent as yet, but with progress under, say, the carbon fund of the FCPF, we might see more benefit sharing schemes actually becoming operational and seeing how that works in practice. But certainly the focus to date has been on setting up such systems and not necessarily yet seeing the flow of finance right down to the community level. But Josefina, you probably can add to that.
Sure. I will say that it depends, and it will vary from one circumstance to the other. It depends also on the type of collaboration, if it's a bilateral collaboration, as Peter was saying, or a multilateral collaboration. Although most of the money spent so far has been for readiness, for the readiness phase, for phase 1, I think that there's been some impact in the participatory processes. And this involves the communities and local actors. And that, for me, is one of the positive things to highlight because so far we know participatory processes are expensive. And the fact that we are having these resources through the readiness phase to engage local actors in the planning and decision making, for me, is very valuable. And the other thing I wanted to highlight is that there's an effort made by Forest Trends that maybe some of you have already seen that tries to track the finance for REDD and tries to track who is giving what money for what and who is receiving this money or what type of recipient it is. So you can find information if you just Google Forest Trends, REDDX, like REDD, R-E-D-D-X. You will find the website they have, and you can go and click in each country that has been receiving funds, what funds have been already committed, what funds have already been disbursed, and who is receiving that money. So that, I mean, that's a nice effort. It's not perfect, of course, and it's not complete, and and still trying to improve the tool, but I believe it's a good reference for anybody that is interested in looking at it.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Claudia, and Claudia asks, are the Cancun standards helping to address social and environmental concerns towards the design and implementation of REDD+, sort of thinking of lessons learned and that kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. I can start with that one. I think REDD countries are undergoing their processes of setting the safeguards information system. So in that sense, I would say it's too soon for us to have an assessment of what is going in the ground, because countries are just starting with this. However, as I was mentioning, in phase 1 of REDD, I think the safeguards are impacting a lot how things are unraveling in the ground, just because you have to have this decision making that is more participative, and you have to organize forums and have more transparency in the information. So in that sense, we have some lessons learned from different countries that are starting with their processes of building the safeguards information systems through multi-stakeholder process. There's experiences in Mexico that will be soon systematized, and I think, as far as I know, they will be sharing this information through the REDD+ web platform in the UNFCCC site, as well as lessons learned from Colombia, working with Afro-Colombian communities on identifying or interpreting the safeguards in their context, and trying to translate these safeguards into principles. So there are some exercises already undergoing that could be useful. I'm thinking also Ecuador also has been moving forward with their process. So I think that, for example, South-South exchanges in this area will be of utmost importance for trying to learn together and to advance together with this topic. But if you ask me, I think it's too soon for us to really comprehend and to really make an assessment if the safeguards of Cancun are working or not.
Great, thank you.
Nothing to add from me other than say, sorry, I'll just add that process of interpretation of the Cancun safeguards by the countries as they design and implement the REDD+ is a key step, and it's where many seem to be at this point.
Perfect. So the next question comes from Peter, and Peter asks, a different Peter, of course, can speakers elaborate on how the relation between INDCs and this REDD+ discussion is? Can we expect INDCs that include REDD without this discussion being formally closed?
Perhaps I can start with that then. Good question. We have, if we think about what does an NDC, nationally determined contribution, entail, if we have that coming from a country, a REDD country, a developing country, then if they plan to address emissions or potential mitigation opportunities within the forest and land sector, within the forest sector particularly, they will include activities that fall under the REDD+ umbrella. So in that sense, REDD+ will be included in NDCs presented by developing countries where they have plans to address the emissions from those sources. Now, the relationship between INDCs and REDD+ for developed countries is a separate issue, or a slightly different issue, and that is sort of twofold. One, if parties are going to be providing information on finance, which was some language around that in the current text coming out of Lima, then they could specify a financial commitment either broadly to mitigation activities in developing countries, but they could also specify, should they decide to, a focus on REDD in areas that they plan to focus on. From the other side of that, if countries are looking to use offsets, for example, or to claim emission reductions achieved by a developing country through REDD Plus activities as a contribution, whether directly to their NDC or as a sort of supplement, then that information would have to be provided in their submission. This again was one of the reasons why we were hoping to have greater clarity expressed in the upfront information guidance that was agreed in Lima.
Okay, the next question. What was the position of developing countries on the results-based payments discussion during the COP in Lima?
Well, there weren't many discussions formal negotiations or discussions specifically addressing results-based payments. But in overall, in the discussions both in the meeting of focal points and the REDD Plus partnership and others, there was no single decision or position of all developing countries, but I would say the general mood was similar to the WWF's message, which is that there's still, excuse me, an outstanding gap in the link to finance for REDD Plus that is adequate and predictable. And so while the GCF developments were encouraging and the additional contributions that were announced were also encouraging, the certainty of an effective and adequate results-based payment incentive for REDD Plus is not yet fully completed. So that's where I would say we're at.
Josefina, do you have anything to add to that one? Well, okay, we'll jump to the next one.
I mean, I guess I will only add that. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say that because there was no space in Lima for having this discussion on results-based payments, there was no specific address, as Peter was mentioning. However, we know that there would be the Standing Committee Forum in this year, where parties will have space to discuss about this issue. So we'll have to wait and see. Probably in June, the forum will take place. So there will be a specific dedicated space for having these discussions then.
Our next question comes from Richard, and Richard asks, what is the future of a REDD Plus emissions trading market under a new agreement? Do you think it's likely that the UNFCCC will create or recognize a REDD Plus market mechanism under a new agreement, or will any markets be left to any domestic initiatives that may develop, such as California or Japan's bilateral crediting offset mechanism? So that is a long question. I'm happy to repeat it for Josefina or Peter if you would like me to.
Thanks, Brain. I can now got the system figured out and I can see it on the screen. What is the future of REDD Plus emissions trading market under a new agreement? Well, as I mentioned, there was no appreciable progress or even much discussion formally that we're aware of in Lima that advanced any work, any details on a new market mechanism or a framework of various approaches under the convention. So it's to say what the future is at the moment, it's very difficult to say. Clearly, we're aware that there are emissions trading systems out there. There's the EU, there's California, and the Western Governors Initiative, and others that, well, they exist. They will be functioning within their jurisdictions or within their scope. How they are recognized by countries at a national level in terms of commitments and their NDCs, not sure at this point. And so, yeah, I guess my response to that is sort of a wait and see. I personally see that there will be a role for markets, whether we like it or not, at a certain scale. Whether REDD Plus is included in that, there are, let's say, developments underway at the moment under ICAO, the International Convention on Aviation, and they are looking at potential REDD Plus offsets, in a sense, for their operations. That's an ongoing discussion, and parties are also deliberating within their groups, within the EU, for example. So a lot of uncertainty would be the first answer. Second answer would be likely there will be a role, whether that's going to be national to national or subnational, somewhat like the California system, is yet to be determined. You did mention Japan's bilateral crediting offset mechanism, and that is one that I'm quite interested in terms of how Japan will recognize that within their nationally determined contribution. Will they specify exactly how much they expect to achieve through emissions reductions in other countries to contribute to their target? Josefina, perhaps you want to add something?
The only thing I will add is that, I mean, REDD is a voluntary mechanism, right? It's so far nobody can force a country to start REDD activities or have a national REDD strategy. In that sense, going or participating into a market is still open. Like REDD decisions recognize a wide variety of sources of funds, including market, non-market, public, private, etc. We know that many countries are against markets. That is the case of Bolivia and even Brazil that have been very vocal rejecting market mechanisms for REDD. I think I mean, it's, as Peter was saying, it's uncertain at the moment, but there are a lot of options. If countries don't want to, like for example, if Bolivia does not want to go into a market for REDD, I mean, it's fine, they don't have to. So there are a lot of possibilities and options open, and the key here is how to work in the rules for a market, if there's going to be one, to guarantee environmental integrity. That's the only thing I will add.
Thank you. And the next question is from Kofi, and Kofi asks, can we know, or is there a list or a tally of all the contributions or pledges for REDD Plus from any or all sources during COP20? Were there any pledges for REDD Plus?
Pledges meaning financial pledges or commitments to reduce emissions from deforestation and degradation? Because, I mean, in any case, we don't have a tally or a list of these contributions. We are working in WWF to map different commitments from REDD countries that have said that they are committing to reduce deforestation and degradation in 30% by 2020, for example. So we are coming up with a compilation of all these commitments to reduce emissions, and we'll have it ready probably in the first trimester of this year. Whether you are referring to financial commitments, again, the best reference would be so far, I mean, there are two references. The voluntary REDD Plus database that was starting in the REDD Plus partnership, and this effort carried out by Forest Trends in their website, where they have mapped all the commitments or the financial commitments and who is receiving what. But so far, there's no, like for example, in the UNFCCC, there's no exercise yet on what are the pledges from countries to reduce emissions. I don't know, Peter, if you have anything to add.
No, I think my reading of the question, I think those sources, the BRD and other sources of REDD finance database will probably be the only things that can answer that question. The Lima challenge was good in terms of finding pledges for additional commitments, but they were not necessarily quantified in terms of the country's goals for emission reductions from REDD+.
So our next question is something that was mentioned very briefly at the beginning, and it's from Andrea, or Andrea. Could you please update us on the status of the REDD+ Information Hub, which was discussed in a special bond session this summer?
Sure, I can give it a try. I was in the Information Hub meeting, I mean, what happened in this meeting, the intention was to discuss how the Information Hub would look like, and how this Information Hub will enhance transparency, and how it can be designed to contain all the information that was agreed in Warsaw. So how they structure the meeting is, well, they invite a couple of countries, Indonesia and Paraguay, if I'm not mistaken. So Indonesia and Paraguay explain their experiences working with databases and how they are inputting the information. And then they had Brazil and the US presenting ideas on how the Info Hub would be looking, and what kind of fields and rows and columns could you develop to input all the information. And it was an interesting discussion in the sense of, I mean, it was highly technical, but it was interesting in the sense of recognizing that some of the information is going to be quite static and it won't change much over time, and another part of the Information Hub needs to be more dynamic and allow for constant updating with respect to, for example, the information on, or the summaries of information on safeguards that have to be submitted more constantly, etc. More static elements, for example, the REDD strategies are not expected to change every single time or every reporting period. So the discussions during the summer or at the beginning of September were focused on that, on these kind of issues. It was very nice to see how a developing country and a developed country presented their ideas, and they were pretty much very convergent. They were looking very similar, and I didn't see any controversy or any issue of concern in that meeting. So now with the adoption of the Information Hub Experts Meeting report, what is next is the Secretariat needs to keep working in developing this platform. So far, the REDD Web platform in the UNFCCC site has been working as the Info Hub. And you can find, for example, the submitted reference levels are already there in the REDD platform. And so in the meantime, this is like an interim solution, is the REDD Web platform. But now the Secretariat will go ahead and develop and design the full Information Hub mask or capture database. I'm not aware of a deadline for doing that, but I'm pretty sure that they will try to work as much as possible this year.
Thank you. And so for the next question, we're going to go over to Tarcisio's question, and this is I know a hot topic, and the question is, as you probably know, in the Amazon, we're working with indigenous peoples in what has been called indigenous REDD, which is something that is perhaps related to the Bolivian position. Do you have any comments or suggestions on how this progressed, or what happened with this at COP20?
I can start, and then Peter, if you have any complements, complementary information. For me, it was very nice to see in Lima the wide range of events related to indigenous REDD. There were many events in the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion, and even formal side events in the COP related to indigenous REDD and this concept. There was even a side event with indigenous leaders, indigenous peoples leaders, and Bolivia, in which they were sharing their convergences or their common elements, and that side event was actually quite interesting. However, although they do share the more holistic and integral view about the forest as an ecosystem that goes beyond carbon, of course, and and had like similar ideas on the integrality of forests. And there's the indigenous REDD recognizes REDD as a tool or as a mean to achieve their objectives of development in the indigenous peoples and local communities. Bolivia has a different idea on the methodological guidance, for example, in terms of monitoring and in terms of safeguards. So that's, I guess, for me, the difference between these proposals is that indigenous REDD embraces REDD and sees it as an opportunity, and Bolivia is saying, no, I want this other alternative approach. I don't think they are mutually exclusive. I think there are commonalities, and I think that even whoever wants to promote an approach that is joint mitigation and adaptation can do it through REDD. Now what is needed, in my view, is showing concrete proposals on so the funds can start flowing. And they did a great job. There were tons of organizations from indigenous peoples that presented what they've been doing and their conceptualization and what they need to do for moving forward to the next step. And for me, that was a great advance in comparison to other COPs where we listened the concept, but we didn't see proposals or pathways on how to move forward with it. So it was a very encouraging COP in terms of indigenous peoples and local communities activities. We know that it was the collaboration between the German government and COICA, the Organization of Indigenous Amazonic Groups, launched their bilateral collaboration that they will have to develop more activities and to move forward this concept of indigenous REDD in the Amazon region. So that was very encouraging. I don't know, I hope I addressed the question correctly.
Thank you. And so we're coming to the end of our time here. We're actually a couple minutes over. So I know there are a few questions we didn't have a chance to answer. And if we're able to, I will try to reach out to those few people via email with some more information on your questions. But as we come to a close, I just wanted to ask Josefina and Peter to each perhaps give us a sentence or two on how you feel about REDD coming out of COP20 and looking ahead, or any sort of lessons learned or big surprises, any closing statements as we wrap up this webinar. Josefina, I'll put you on the spot.
No problem, Bryn. I think for me the importance of Lima for REDD is Warsaw was all about the rules, and parties managed to get this Warsaw framework for REDD. And Lima was about showcasing progress and showing that REDD can become a reality. So that was encouraging for me to see. There were tons of side events. There were many experiences shared. And REDD Plus Day, I think it was a good idea to promote action, and I hope they maintain this. What is next for me is, of course, there are technical issues that are pending, and we'll have to wait and see what happened in June. But the most important part is to show progress and to show results to demonstrate that REDD can happen, actually. So that, for me, is the focus of this year.
Thank you. Peter, any closing thoughts for us?
Sure. Very briefly, from my experience in previous roles in the negotiations, where achieving the Warsaw framework was a culmination of many years of difficult, lengthy discussions, where by the end of it, it was a wonderful success in Warsaw, but it was not clear that things would actually be implemented very quickly. And so I have to say what we saw in Lima with the presentation, well, first the Brazil's reference level review having been completed, and then the presentation of so many more reference levels for assessment, for technical assessment, and the additional commitments of REDD countries for both unilateral and supported action was, I would be honest, I was actually surprised by the pace of progress towards actual implementation, and so that that for me helped overcome some of the negativity around limited progress in other areas.
Thank you. Well, thanks to everyone. I'm just going to flip through our last few slides here. You can always reach us on these websites and links if you're looking for more information. And thank you again for spending your hour and 5 minutes with us. And we hope you'll join us next time. And with that, I will bring us to a close. Thank you.